Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Direct Advisors podcast. I'm Tom Santa Barbara, president of Direct Advisors. Today, I'm going to be joined by Chief Investment Officer Jeff Fricuti, who's one of the certified financial planners here at Direct Advisors. Our podcast today will be focusing on the CARES Act, which has come up frequently with our clients and plan participants over the last few weeks. Jeff, welcome. Let's talk a little bit about the CARES Act.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so the CARES Act was signed into law about 3 weeks ago on March 27th. And what it stands for is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And really what it is, it's a $2 trillion economic relief package. And it was passed as another component of the many stimulus and relief efforts that the federal government has been putting forth over the last month or so. Really, the intention was to help to stabilize the economy, just because of the severe disruptions that have been going on, both economically, financially, also health-wise, all caused by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Jeff, there's been a lot of legislation running around today. And how is this CARES Act going to affect the retirement world? Will employer-sponsored retirement plans be affected?
Yeah, so the CARES Act has opened up a number of provisions for employer-sponsored plans, and what it's trying to do is make additional funds available to plan participants who are impacted specifically by COVID-19. The major retirement plan provisions that are impacted by the legislation are in regard to distributions and loans, as well as other aspects such as required minimum distributions. It is important to point out, though, that the new provisions that were put in place in regard to distributions and loans are in fact optional, meaning that plan sponsors are not required to implement any provisions in addition to what they might have in place currently on the retirement plan versus the new RMD rules that we'll talk about in a minute. Those pretty much apply across the board and basically makes it easier to operate plans and makes it easier for participants.
Jeff, before we get into the specifics of these programs and provisions, many of our clients are wondering why the distributions and loan provisions are optional. What are some of the reasons that a plan sponsor may not want to add these provisions to their retirement plan?
It's a great question, Tom. It is important to remember that investment accounts, especially employer-sponsored plans such as 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, those are all designed for retirement purposes. As a result, they have a long-term objective, contrary to other accounts you might have, other brokerage accounts, savings accounts, checking accounts. Employer-sponsored plans should not be viewed as rainy day funds or emergency funds. They're there for retirement. While we do recognize, though, that things are difficult right now for many people, it's very early on in the crisis, relatively speaking. Now, as things progress and we move forward, if other financial avenues are exhausted for plan participants, perhaps at that time, individuals may need to look to their retirement accounts as almost like a last resort. We do encourage people, though, to look to other sources of funds and other sources of income, such as unemployment insurance, if they have more liquid assets like savings accounts, for the time being to bridge that gap. And again, we just want to emphasize that retirement accounts are meant for the long term. And as a result, there's many protections put in place around those accounts so people aren't tempted to raid them for non-retirement purposes. As a result, I've found in speaking with many plan sponsors and our clients that they're hesitant to put these optional provisions into place right now. They really don't want to see their employees raid their retirement accounts that they've spent their careers building up. And really, once people start to pull these funds from their retirement, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to make those funds up at a later time, jeopardizing their retirement plans.
I hear you, Jeff, and I think our audience is going to want a little bit more on the specifics. Like, what do we need to know about the optional distribution provision?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, these optional provisions are designed for people who are specifically impacted by COVID-19. And as a result, only certain participants under this distribution provision may withdraw up to $100,000 during 2020 across all of their cumulative retirement plans. When I say certain participants, that means that any participant, their spouse, or any of their dependents must have been diagnosed with COVID-19 or suffered adverse financial consequences as a result of the pandemic. Participants will self-certify that they're impacted, so it's somewhat on the honor system. Some of the pluses, though, of this optional distribution is that the 10% early withdrawal penalty that typically applies to anyone who's under the age of 59 and a half will actually be waived completely. And they're also going to waive the 20% statutory federal income tax withholding. Now, it is important to note that that 20% federal income tax, while it's not withheld, will potentially be due at tax time. So basically, whatever your tax situation is, when you go to do your 2020 taxes, you will still owe your full tax liability. The only difference is that the income tax was not held up front, as is typically the case. Additionally, if you do take one of these COVID-19 distributions, participants can choose to recontribute those funds to their retirement plans within 3 years. That's different than any other distribution that we've seen in the past. It's actually somewhat similar to a loan in that you do have the option to put those funds back into the plan. There's still more guidance that we're waiting on in regard to that repayment. We don't have all the details as far as the timing and systematically how that might work, but they have put that provision in there. The other thing that they've put into play is if you do not repay the funds back into the plan, you have to pay the income tax within 3 years. So those distributions can begin immediately if permitted by the plan sponsor, but the plan language in the plan document has to be amended by the end of the plan year beginning on or after January 2022.
Okay, Jeff, that was a lot. Let's talk a little about the optional loan provisions.
Yeah, so we have a lot of fun details here as well. Again, those same defined certain participants are the only ones that would have access to these additional loan provisions, which would be you can take a loan for the lesser of $100,000, which is twice the current limit, or you can take 100% of your vested account balance as a loan. Again, you have to meet that specific definition of an impacted participant. Additionally, if you already have loans that are outstanding, any loan payments that are due from basically the end of March through the end of the year of 2020, you can delay those payments back into the plan for 1 year. However, interest will continue to accrue. You can also extend the term of the loan on the back end for up to 1 year. So they're giving additional flexibility for currently outstanding loans as well. Again, any COVID-19 loans can begin immediately if allowed by the plan sponsor, but again, that plan language has to be updated through amendment by the end of the plan year beginning January 2022.
Okay, and there's one more provision, Jeff. It's RMDs, or required minimum distributions. Can you do a little more elaboration on that?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, the provision regarding RMDs, this is going to apply across the board. You do not have to, opt into this, basically. And what they're doing is they're giving additional flexibility on RMDs for participants. Any RMDs that were due to be taken during 2020 are temporarily suspended. So you don't have to take those RMDs if you don't want to. If you were already planning on taking your first RMD between January 1st and April 1st of this year, so basically during that first quarter, those are temporarily suspended as well. If you were taking a 5-year death distribution, 2020 won't be counted as part of that 5-year clock. Again, anyone who's taking RMDs, if you still want to take a distribution, it's not like that's frozen. You can still opt to do that. It's just that it's suspended for the majority of people. Again, if you choose to move forward with this, or if you see this happening in your plan, if you have participants who are impacted by this, you still have to update your plan document. It still falls under that same rule as the other two provisions we talked about, where the document has to be updated over the next couple of years. But again, that's going to take effect immediately if you have participants who are impacted by that.
Well, Jeff, there's certainly a lot to consider here. What would your overall message be to anyone listening to this podcast?
Yes, and this has been a common question that I've been getting when speaking to clients as far as what we're recommending and putting out there. I can't make a blanket recommendation for everyone, but again, for most clients who I've spoken to, I've advised them to hold off on implementing any of the optional provisions regarding loans and distributions. There's just too many potential negative consequences to participants, and clients, for the most part, seem to agree with that. If the situation does continue again for a little while longer, if we don't see any light at the end of the tunnel, it could make sense to revisit these optional provisions and perhaps at that point put them into play. But the last thing I would want to see would be someone who's left with a mountain of debt to the IRS, or someone who may not be able to retire who was planning on retiring previously.
Well, Jeff, there's a lot to consider here by plan sponsors, but thank you for taking the time to address the CARES Act today. If you are a client of Direct Advisors listening to this, please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions on the legislation, or if you would like to discuss any of the provisions that we discussed as they relate to your retirement plan. If you're not a client and are listening to this podcast, we encourage you to contact us and discuss how we can help you. We can be reached at info@directadvisors.com. That's info@directadvisors.com, or by calling us directly at 518-362-2119. I'm Tom Santa Barbara for Jeff Ricciuti, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the latest edition of Direct Advisors Retirement Podcast Series.